Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So, hello. Hello. Welcome to the first historical Foodways, Seed, Hearth, and Taste, a series of book talks inspired by many wonderful conversations between Kathy McCormick and me around our shared love and deep reverence for food, cooking, and all that emerges from it. Authentic art, story, culture, and creativity. I'm going to put out a definition of foodways, and there are many interpretations of foodways, and we will certainly learn this evening from Maureen, but I picked up this from the Lexicon of Sustainability just to kind of set the tone a little bit. Foodways are the story of what and why we eat, with emphasis on cultural food events as much as the food itself. The study of foodways is important to cultural studies and includes issues of race, class, gender, economy, environment, geography, and history. And that's from the Lexicon of Sustainability. This three-part series of discussions features stories of heirloom seeds, hearth cooking, and how taste connects us to land, culture, and history. We will explore this evening and in the coming months how historical foodways inform our present and future food system. We will engage culinary historians, food writers such as Ramin, seed savers, cooks, and thought leaders who are dedicated to sharing the ways in which food brings meaning, value, and connection to our lives. So thank you, Kathy, for your passion and generosity that you bring into our community. Thank you, Judy, you're here, and the Perrot team for all you do to make Perrot's incredible programming happen, and for partnering with many community organizations. Your support in this way is a significant contribution to all of us. I just want to make a note to please join us for our second book discussion on July 17th. Perrot will host Dion Jones, the Director of Network Engagement at Slow Food USA, and we will discuss Slow Food Arc of Taste, which is all about the joy and justice of biodiversity and its global grassroots effort to catalog a range of foods around us before they disappear. And to raise awareness about how we can act together to preserve and promote those foods. And I'm realizing I didn't introduce myself. My name is Ali Ghiorse, and I'm the founder of the Foodshed Network. The Forum is a program of the Foodshed Network, and it's in collaboration with the Greenwich Conservation Commission. So, thank you for being here.
So I'm Kathy McCormick. I'm board president here at Perrot Memorial Library, and thank you so much for joining us. I want to start by saying all our programs are made possible through the generous contributions of the members of the Perrot Memorial Library Association. If you're not a member, please consider joining us. You can pick up an envelope, or you can visit our website for details on how to become a member. Second, I wanted to say first how I first met Ramin. I was at the Westport History Museum, and she came and she introduced herself as the director of the Westport History Museum. But one of her colleagues interrupted to say, and celebrated cookbook author, or celebrated author, journalist, culinary historian, and the list went on and on and on. And I immediately said, I know someone that you have to meet, and it was Ali Ghiorse, who's done so much in educating Greenwich about the importance of historical foodways. So that's how this came to be. And after, right when I came home to show that this event was meant to be, I was catching up on the New York Times, and sure enough, there's an article in the food section about Caribbean black cake, and the author was Ramin Ganeshram. So it was indeed true that she is a New York Times journalist. So Ramin was born in New York City to Trinidadian and Iranian parents. In addition to being director of the Westport History Museum, she is a journalist and professionally trained chef at the Institute of Culinary Education. She's the author of several cookbooks, including Future Chefs, which is an IACP award winner. Her writing has been featured in the New York Times, Newsday, Saveur, Gourmet Bon Appetit, and many other publications. She has also appeared as a guest on Throwdown with Bobby Flay. Welcome, Ramin. And also, she did appear more recently in the New York Times food section on February 21st, all about the subject of tonight, Hercules Posey, and the journalist cook. Thank you, Ramin, for joining us.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. I got an amazing surprise when I walked up. My sister and nephew are here, and she's actually a chef who is way better than me. So it's a real treat to have her here with us tonight. So, yes, so who is Chef Hercules Posey? I just want to say a word before we start, and I think maybe we'll talk about this in a little bit. How historians, particularly historians of enslaved communities, do our work, because it's actually not as easy as cracking open a book or a history to do that work. So we find clues everywhere. And I just want to point out to you this painting. So how many people here have been to Mount Vernon, George Washington's Mount Vernon? Okay, so you recognize that red roof, right? You notice the little buildings to the left and to the right. What's different about that roof?
Different color.
It's a different color, it's blue. So the roofs on the buildings at Mount Vernon were blue actually for a very long period in their history. They changed over during the Revolutionary War. Washington changed the color to red. We know this painting was done in the late 18th century, if not actually during the war, but it is meant to portray that transitional period. It probably was during the transitional period because it's not really a detail that somebody would make up. And you can see that George and Martha and one of the granddaughters are in the foreground, and he is wearing his Continental Army uniform. Right, so these are the ways there's a million ways that we put together little clues when the facts are not readily available. So who was Chef Hercules Posey, and what does his history, his story, tell us about foodways and food history? So you can read this, but I'm going to read it to you. This was actually written by George Washington's step-grandson, Martha Washington's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. He grew up with the family, and he wrote a book called Recollections and Private Memoirs of Washington. And he actually devoted 3 full pages to talking about the cook. And he says the chief cook would have been termed in modern parlance a celebrated artiste. He was named Hercules and familiarly termed Uncle Harkless. Uncle Harkless was at the period of the first presidency as highly accomplished a proficient in the culinary art as could be found in the United States. His underlings flew in all directions to execute his orders, while he, the great master spirit, seemed to possess the power of ubiquity and to be everywhere at the same moment. The memoir goes on to say that he could not tolerate it when people were poor at their job, if they were dirty, if they didn't follow a command exactly, if anything went on in the kitchen looking horrible, he would fly into a rage. Who does that sound like? It's like Gordon Ramsay, right? He was this very Gordon Ramsay-esque figure. But here's what I want to tell you about what is surprising about that statement I just made to you. Hercules Posey was an enslaved man. In the president's house in Philadelphia, everyone that he commanded, the scullery maids, right? The young women who worked as assistants in the kitchen, the scullions, the young men who worked as assistants in the kitchen, the hired cooks, were all white. So he wasn't commanding other enslaved people. He was commanding free white or indentured white servants. So I want you to just think about that, right, in this period of time. So here's just a little bit of a dossier on Hercules. He self-emancipates from Mount Vernon on Washington's 16th birthday in 1797. You hear me say the word self-emancipate, so when we historians of enslavement talk about this topic, we don't say escapes, right? We don't say ran away. This is agency. He made a decision to free himself from bondage, so he self-emancipated. Washington was in Philadelphia at the time. He was only seen once more in Manhattan in 1801 by the New York City Mayor Varick, Richard Varick, and then he disappeared from the annals of history. In 2019, a colleague of mine, Sarah Krasny, at the museum, we discovered that he was in fact buried in New York City at the Second African Burying Ground, that he had remained in New York. So after we found that little tidbit out, I went and I started digging some more, and now I'm reconstructing his life for a narrative biography that was just sold to Simon & Schuster. So you'll see that in a couple of years. So he lived out his life in New York City. And what I also found out is that he worked as both a cook and a laborer. He earned enough money while he was in New York to have himself listed in the city directories, which weren't like yellow pages or white pages for those of us who remember those, right? It wasn't that you could just be in it, you had to pay to be in it. So he earned enough money to be in it. I should say to you that when he was in Philadelphia with Washington as an enslaved man, he was allowed to sell what was called slops, the leftovers from the kitchen, the usable trim, things that could be reused by someone else. Let's say a soup bone to make a soup if you were kind of a poorer person, or peelings for pigs and that sort of thing. And Washington let him sell those things. And he earned $200 a year doing that. And he was known to have loved clothing. He loved fine clothing, and he was known to buy clothes with it. And Washington also allowed him to leave the house after he was done cooking, as long as he was back at night. I don't want you to think that that was freedom, right? Because as Mary Baraka said, almost free is not free, right? He still was owned by Washington. But by comparison, an overseer at Mount Vernon earned $100 a year. So Hercules was earning twice that much while he was in Philadelphia. I'll talk a little bit later about the lengths that Washington went to make sure that the enslaved people he brought into the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania remained that way, which involved flouting the state law of Pennsylvania as the President of the United States. But before we talk about that, what did Hercules cook? So this is a tricky question. We don't actually know what he cooked because we don't have recipes from him. But we do know because of a number of different ways, and this is how I and many historians kind of put together the truth. We have letters from congressmen, who had dinners and lunches at the president's house talking about what they ate. Well, the chief cook was Hercules, so that's how we know he made those things. The household accounts of Washington, we know what was in the larder, we know what was purchased, imported from overseas, purchased locally, and sent up from Mount Vernon by ship. So Washington expended a lot of what we would call air miles, but really sea miles, to bring food to his door, right? So this idea that people in the 18th century always ate completely locally and they had a better kind of view on food, it's not unlike now. It depended on how much money you had, right? He was importing things from Europe, from India. One of the things that Washington had in his larder very regularly was pickled Indian limes. So if any of you go to Indian restaurants and you have the pickled limes, yeah. So Washington really liked those. But so here are some of the things that were mentioned and also were common in the period, right? So chocolate torte, this is chocolate cream pie. Salmagundi. How many of you go out to eat and you say, I'll just have a salad with some chicken on it, or a piece of salmon, or some steak? That's the salmagundi, right? It's a composed salad. Fish. Washington loved fish. It was his favorite thing. And so this is an important concept, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But fish, any way you can imagine. Pepper pot. Pepper pot is actually a thick stew that's made with offcuts of meat. It comes from the Caribbean. It came up here in the 18th century, and it was the sort of the city dish of Philadelphia. Potato balls, so these are like deep fried potato fritters. Standing pork pie. So this is like a meat turnover, but where the crust was very elaborate. And in fact, that crust, which was highly decorated, it was the container for the meat, and it was called actually a coffin. That's what they called that kind of crust in that period of time. Ice cream. So you're like, oh, ice cream. You have to understand that to have ice cream in this period of time was very rare, because to get ice, you had to cut ice out of a river, out of a lake, out of a stream, and you had to be rich enough to have an ice house to put it in. At Mount Vernon, in the depths of winter, the enslaved men would cut ice out of the Potomac and put it in Washington's ice house. Pocket soup. So pocket soup is essentially a jelly, thick jelly that could be still like jiggly and wet, like a savory Jello, or it could be almost like a rawhide. And what this was for was when you were traveling, you could take out this thing and drop it in boiling water, and suddenly you had soup. So think of it as a highly reduced soup. Shrewsbury biscuits. These are shortbread cookies. They were flavored with caraway, salmon, Mount Vernon ham. So Mrs. Washington was very proud of her hams, and she was always having hams sent up from Mount Vernon. The general, as he was called, in fact, even when he was president, there are letters of his writing to people to whom he gifted Mount Vernon hams, and he would say, I'm eager to know how you like the hams, because Mrs. Washington is very proud of her hams. So very common for the Virginia plantation housewife. So, sorry about the funky font, I don't know what happened there, but how did Washington eat? So the thing is, his meals had to be fit for a king, but they also had to show that he wasn't a king, because, right, that was the issue. We don't want another king. So he demanded that the meals were elegant without being royal, which meant that all the ingredients were the highest quality. The preparation was very complex. Sort of the most fashionable food of the period. If you can think about it like sort of a 3 or 4 star restaurant today, but on Washington's table. Everything that he served was meant to demonstrate his own wealth, right? Not everybody had pickles from India. Not everybody had a larder full of sweet oil. Does anyone want to guess what sweet oil was? Olive oil. So Washington had a lot of olive oil. Not everybody had spices, from the Far East and so on, but he did. And this was a way to show, I'm a very, very wealthy individual. I have power, right? So food was used to demonstrate power in a very subtle way in the Washington household. And the other thing that he did, or that Hercules did, was to create a table that had local goods, local to the very immediate area, local to the coastwise trade up and down the east coast of the United States, the Caribbean, Europe, and as a way of showing both the worldliness of the new United States and the hyper-localness and the bounty of the United States. Washington had 2 dinners, or 2 special engagements that he had weekly. You could visit him on Tuesdays between 3 and 4 by appointment. And Thursday he had a Congress dinner for the members of Congress. Everybody hated this because he was a terrible, terrible host. He did not like to have dinners. He did not like chit chat. He would not talk. He didn't give toasts. We know this because of letters. Congressmen sort of were dragged to their death when they were going to the president's house for dinner. And when he got tired of you, he would take his spoon and start tapping on the table. And you knew, that's it, the dinner's over. But Friday, Mrs. Washington had these levees for the ladies of society. And the thing that George Washington loved to do the most was dance. He was a great dancer and he loved it. And he loved to go and meet with these daughters and wives of diplomats and Congress people and dance. But here's why this is important to me. It meant that Hercules was cooking all these dinners, as well as 3 meals a day, and tea, and anytime somebody stopped by. And each one of these things had to tell a story. Nothing could be off, nothing could be not great, nothing could be less than perfect. Because this was the first everything, right? The first meal for the first president of this new democracy. Everything was being watched, right? If any of you have seen Hamilton, there's a line in Hamilton where they say this, the first trial, everything we do is the first. Well, Washington knew it and Hercules knew it. So not only was he working 18 hours a day, not only was he working 18 hours a day in close proximity to the man and woman who enslaved him, he was doing it with this expectation of absolute perfection at all times. There was no room for mistakes. The other thing that Hercules did, and he was great at, was curating meals to the audience, right? So if it was gentlemen, it might be a more meat-heavy meal, roasts and so on. But at Mrs. Washington's Friday night levees, he also had to make very delicate, very pretty, lovely little items for women to eat, right? So this is actually an excerpt from Abigail Adams writing to a friend about one of these levees, and she says she gives tea, coffee, cake, lemonade, and ice creams. So I just want you to know that ice creams at this time wasn't like, here's a scoop in a bowl. That's not what happened. It was actually molded into a very elaborate tin mold and then released, and so these little ice creams were all little sculptures. And so this is the kind of thing that he was doing for these events. So what Hercules cooked was high Georgian cuisine. A lot of people said to me, oh, so he cooked in the French style, because many of you have heard of James Hemmings, the enslaved cook of Thomas Jefferson, who did in fact go to France with him and did learn to cook in France. That is not what Hercules was cooking. He was cooking high Georgian cuisine, meaning the cuisine of the English aristocracy, because of course, up until about 5 years before, they were all English, right? So that's how they ate. There were French preparations within this cuisine from the Norman times, right? So just to remind you, William the Conqueror, 1066, came from Brittany into England and brought a lot of French language and cuisine and so on. So there were some French things. Washington was really interesting because he ate this way even when he was on campaign in the war. So he rented enslaved cooks from a New York minister. So just like Connecticut, New York, the enslavers in these two states were, for the most part, ministers, judges, and lawyers, unlike plantation owners in the South. So there was a New York minister who rented Hannah and Isaac Till to Washington, and they cooked for him during the war. And they cooked these very elaborate meals. So when you hear about Valley Forge and the soldiers starving, Washington wasn't among them, right? He was just fine. So I mentioned fish to you, and I said we're going to talk about why that's important. Well, so what that meant was, and so this is actually a quote from that same memoir. He ate heartily, but was not particularly on his diet, with the exception of fish, of which he was excessively fond. So Hercules and the other cooks at Mount Vernon and Mr. and Mrs. Till had to be very skilled in preparing fish a number of ways and a number of different kinds of fish. Anybody here, I know Ali and I know myself, anyone here have experience working in professional kitchens? And not my sister. Anyone else? No? All right, so I'm going to explain something to you. The ability to fabricate fish, to work with fish, is a highly specialized skill. We all do it, but the chefs who are skilled specifically in cooking fish in a high-end restaurant are often, that's all they do, right? Hercules was doing that too, right? So just imagine the level of skill of this man. And yet, he could make simple food too. So this was another favorite dish of Washington. It's called a hoe cake. You might know it as a Johnny cake. It's a cornmeal pancake. This is from a visitor, a Polish nobleman who was visiting, and he writes when he visited Mount Vernon that he eats cakes made from maize because of his teeth. He makes slices spread with honey and butter. Right, so everyone knew about Washington's terrible teeth. It was well known, and it caused him a lot of pain. So he would basically make a mush out of this. Very, very simple. The enslaved community ate this too, not with honey and butter, but just plain. So he could go from the highest cuisine to the most humble cuisine. So, okay, sorry. So that's just kind of an overview. The thing that I didn't mention here, which I'll say to you, just in terms of having an understanding of Hercules' time in Philadelphia. The Commonwealth of Philadelphia had what was called a gradual abolition law that was passed in 1780, so during the Revolution. And what it said was that if you were an enslaved person, you were in the Commonwealth for 6 months, you were then free. There was different layers to it, right? You had to be an adult of age, and there were different rules for kind of a period of indenture if you were young. I'm not going to get into all of that, but what it meant was for Hercules and Austin and Giles and other adults, Mull, people who he had brought, the 9 people he had brought up from Virginia, they would have been free had they remained. And so what our first president did was he worked with our first Attorney General of the United States to figure out how to subvert this Pennsylvania law so he would not lose his enslaved people. And what he did was he took them to a slave state, even for a day, across the Delaware to New Jersey, preferably back down to Mount Vernon. And the reason was the Attorney General decided that if you left the Commonwealth and came back, your time would be reset. So for the 8 years that he was President of the United States, he was repeatedly resetting the time of the people that he held captive to ensure that they would stay that way. So I'm gonna read a little bit of this book to you, and then Ali and I are gonna talk, but does anyone have questions for me? I'm happy to answer any questions. It doesn't have to be about this particularly. Yes?
How did he learn his skills?
So the question was, I don't know if you all heard that, how did Hercules learn his skills? So he learned in a way that cooks still learn today, in an apprentice system, where he learned from older cooks with experience. He would have been a scullion, he would have peeled vegetables, he would have picked over peas, picked over rice, been given the job of turning a spit, and he would have learned from older enslaved cooks. At the time that he was young, the cooks were Dahl was one of the cooks, and Frank. And so that's who he would, and Nathan, and he would have learned from them until he was skilled enough.
And because they were not allowed to learn to read and write, for the most part, they had to pass this down orally.
Right. So
And
this,
to get these things right when they're so precise is amazing.
it is amazing. So I don't know if you all heard the question, or the statement was that, of course, there were laws in Virginia and other places that prohibited enslaved people from reading and writing, learning to read and write. So everything that they knew how to do was by oral tradition. So what might have happened was that Martha Washington might have come down with, Hannah Glass's English cookbook, or her own Martha Washington, her book that she inherited from her first husband, and read it to the chef, to the enslaved chefs, right? And it was just trial and error. So what I want you to know that before there was culinary school, like pretty much well into the early 20th century, this is how chefs learned. They continued to learn that way. And when you go to culinary school, to finish, you have to do something called staging. You have to be a stagiaire, where you do this. You go into a professional kitchen and you do all these low-level jobs to work your way up, right? So it's a very time-honored tradition that goes back, into antiquity. But yes, he had to keep all of this in his head. Does anyone else have a question for me, or? No? Okay. So I'm gonna read a little bit to you guys, and I lost my place. I won't go on too long. How much time do we?
Plenty of time.
Okay. I have to tell you, and those who know me in this audience will know that I'm being very brief, because I could talk about Hercules. I could talk to him for 10 hours straight, until the point where they'd be like, please stop talking, right? So, so I'm trying to be very brief. So that's why I say stop me at any time, ask me any question, because I'm not getting to everything I would normally say. Okay, so this scene is in the president's house in Philadelphia. The year is 1793. And this is a scene in the kitchen among everyone who's in the kitchen, including other enslaved people that are in the Washington household. There's a name that you might know. Some of you do. Do any of you know the name Ona Judge? Oni Judge. So Ona Judge was Martha Washington's lady's maid. And she was brought at the age of 15 up to Philadelphia to be her maid. And so she's a character in this. Reverend Allen means to make his church today. Oni rushed into the kitchen and panted the words out. She held one of the First Lady's shawls. Jane, boil me some water, will you? She said to the scullery maid, peeling vegetables at the other end of the long table. I need to wash out this perfume while Mrs. Washington spilled on this before it sets into the weave. Ask the laundress for some soap, too. Hercules set down his knife he was using to cut paper-thin slices of the smoked hams sent up from Mount Vernon. The First Lady was serving it as a cold plate this evening at her weekly Friday night soiree for the women of Philadelphia society. Mount Vernon ham was a particular favorite of the president, who always dropped in on the evenings with a gaggle of ladies, who invariably gave him plenty of attention. The admiration of the finer sex was the one kind of social event Washington enjoyed. Oni Judge, you are not the master of this kitchen, Hercules growled, and I'll thank you not to charge in here and order people around. You know good enough where the pots are and the well pump, and the lye too, for that matter. See to your water yourself. Oni went to fetch a small iron pot, glaring at Hercules as she passed, although he had gone back to slicing the ham as though nothing had happened. She filled the pot with water from the pump that stood by the stone sink near the window and set it among the coals on the hearth. While she waited for the water to boil, she went to the laundry house and came back holding a small cake of lye soap and a long wooden fork. When the water boiled, she grabbed a cloth and carefully hoisted the small pot onto the work table near Hercules and slowly lowered the shawl inside. Hercules silently watched Oni lift the shawl out, soap it well, and drop it back into the pot. "What exactly are you doing, Oni Judge?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "How is it that you don't have the good sense to do that in the laundry room and not here where I'm preparing food?" Oni flopped into a chair. "Of course I do," she said, "but I also have the sense to know that all of you in here will sure want to know about the Reverend Allen's church. I reckon Fanny don't care much about it either way, seeing as she only gets paid on how much washing she gets done, and not for listening to stories." Hercules made a sound like a grunt, then took the platter of meats to the larder and placed it on a wooden bench and covered it with a clean linen cloth. When he returned, he picked up the ham bone and scraped it down with his knife. He put the bone in a large-footed kettle that was simmering gently in the fire, and then went to the other side of the kitchen. "Well, go on then," he said, coming back with 3 eggs in a bowl. "Richmond, bring me a half cup of sugar, 2 cups Indian meal, and nutmeg with my grater," he called over his shoulder to his son, who sat husking dried corn by the open kitchen door. "You, Margaret, I need a molded crock, the one with the corn stalks on it." Margaret nervously leapt up when she heard her name, knocking over the low stool she had been sitting on, shelling peas. Beside her, Jane, the youngest and lowest ranking of the hired scullery males, snickered. She came with her mother Matilda on Friday when soiree preparation required more hands. Hercules didn't care for either of them because they didn't seem to understand how things were in this house. He knew they saucily called him General Kitchen behind his back. "Something amusing, Lady Jane?" Hercules said sharply, staring at the bony girl hunched over the wide pan of peas. Now it was Jane's turn to jump. "No," she mumbled. "What was that then?" Hercules said louder this time, his voice ominous enough to cause Matilda to look up from the corner table where she was kneading bread, and for Monsieur Julien, the hired French cook, to pause and glance over from where he was shucking oysters. "Begging your pardon for nothing," she answered him sullenly, looking down at the peas she continued to shell, sliding her thumb down the length of the split dry pot. The kitchen was so silent, the chink of each pea hitting the tin pan echoed loudly. Hercules let his eyes sweep around the rest of the staff in the kitchen, challenging anyone to step out of line. Jane looked over at her mother, whose eyes warned her to mind her tone. Here in this kitchen, Hercules was master. It wasn't for them to question the manner in which the President or Mrs. Washington kept their house. Hercules saw Julian in his corner shake his head. He often told Hercules how odd he found Americans with their talk of liberty and freedom, and if they continued on with this business of holding slaves. "Chef," Julian said, "would you taste this sauce before I pour it over the oysters?" Hercules knew that Julian didn't really need his opinion. The man had worked in some of the finest houses in Paris. As his eyes met Julian's, a small smile of appreciation played at the corners of his mouth. It was the Frenchman's way of showing the little slatter in her place. It had been Julian who, in the French manner, insisted on calling him chef. Hercules was indebted to him for that. Julian was the first white man who treated him like a true equal. The Frenchman was inspired by James Hemmings, Mr. Jefferson's cook, who was also called chef, having been educated to cook in Paris. "Certainly, Mr. Julian," said Hercules, going to the Frenchman's corner, "although I know that your taste is far superior to mine." He leaned over and slipped his pinky into the thick white sauce in a small iron pot that Julian had brought over from the hearth. He thought a minute. "A bit more salt, I would say, but only a bit," he said. Julian smiled and said, "Just so, chef, just so." He added a pinch of salt to the sauce from the box on the table and stirred it vigorously. "Now then," said Hercules to Oni, as he returned to his own table where Richmond had set down the dry goods before returning to husking the corn. "What is this about Reverend Allen and his church?" "Not just Allen, but them who has started the Free African Society are going to make a real and proper church for black folk," she began while peering into the pot and giving the shawl a swish with the stick. "They're moving that old abandoned blacksmith shop from the prison yard down to the property that Mr. Allen owns at the end of 6th Street. What I often say about this book is that this book is about 80% true. It was fictionalized because at the time I wrote it, kind of all that was known or all that I could find about Hercules was very limited. But I've been doing this work for 15 years. Even after the book was printed, published, sent to the editor, I continued to do research, and that's of course how we found him in New York. And so a lot of this is true. So the Reverend Richard Allen was free. He was born enslaved. He was one of 2 ministers in Philadelphia who had basically been responsible for starting what became the AME Church. And he did in fact buy an old blacksmith shop and have it dragged by a team of workhorses to some property he owned in 6th Street. If you want to see what this looked like, there is a painting, a lithograph, in a book called Birch's Views of Philadelphia. You can look at it on Wikipedia. And John Birch and his son were artists, engravers, and they depicted this scene. So a lot of what's in here is true, and then with fictional storylines. And I'll just say one more thing, and then we could talk. This picture, not Hercules, and that's how I found him. So what had happened was this picture, for the longest time, had the title Portrait of Washington's Cook. And it hangs in the Museo Thyssen-Bornemisza in Spain. It was presumed to be a Gilbert Stuart. And the museum would never let this painting be authenticated. My colleagues at Mount Vernon did an exhibit called Lives Bound Together about slavery at Mount Vernon, that was from 2015 to 2019. The painting came to Mount Vernon, it was finally authenticated. And the findings were embargoed until 2019, that in fact it was, not a Gilbert Stuart, and likely, and not Hercules. And then in fact it was a free person, a free African person in the West Indies. The costume is a free African person in the West Indies. In places like Barbados and Dominica, there were these free communities. They had a very specific way of dressing. So my colleague Craig Laban, he's the food critic for the Philadelphia Inquirer, also very interested in Hercules. We went to the same journalism school, went to Columbia Journalism School. He called me and he said, he was the only reporter allowed there. He was the only reporter who was there ahead of the embargo. And he was given the opportunity to write the story. So he called me before the story was published and said, I want to tell you something. It's kind of upsetting, the picture on your book, and there's a storyline about the painting in the book, fictionalized. It's not Hercules. And I said, I know it's not Hercules. And he said, what do you mean? I said, that's not a chef's toque. Chef's toques didn't come to America till the 1820s or 30s. And the rest of the costume is late 18th century. But whoever this man is kept Hercules alive all this time because people believed it was him, right? But what I did was, I know that in our culture, in Trinidadian culture, particularly in the church, wearing white is a sign of prominence in Black churches, right? So this is the costume of a free person in Dominica, but whoever he is, he's important. He is wearing all white. So I started to think, what if he did go to the West Indies? And what if he had himself painted as a free man? That is not what happened, but this painting made me start looking for him again, right? Because at that point everyone was like, and so we don't even know what happened to him. And I just, I wouldn't let it go. And I'm still not letting it go. So anyway, so that's a little bit about Hercules Posey and my life researching him. Thank you for listening. You had a question?
Yes, how did Hercules become such a important focus for you? Where did that start?
I'll tell you that I'm going to say something to you that you might think is crazy. But for many of us, and especially those of us who work trying to surface this history, there are times when you're guided by the hands of your ancestors, and that is what happened to me, because I was running a soul food cookbook with a chef named Jeff Henderson, a very famous chef, at the time celebrity chef, and Jessica Harris, who was responsible for the series High on the Hog. I had been speaking to her, and I said to Jessica, I'm looking for people to write essays for this cookbook, and she said, oh, there's this guy, he worked for President Clinton, and he is just kind of really interested in Black chefs in the White House. You should call him and see if he'll do an essay for you. So I did. And we were talking about it. He has since written many books. His name is Adrian Miller. He wrote a book called The President's Kitchen Cabinet, a book called Soul Food, another one called Black Smoke. And he was telling me about, Lyndon Johnson's cook, and of course James Hemings. And he said to me, of course, this predates the White House. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess that makes sense. Because, the White House, Washington never lived in the White House, right? Adams was the first person to live in what became the White House. And what he said to me was, yeah, Washington had this cook, this cat named Hercules, just like that, this cat named Hercules. And it was like a lightning bolt went right through me. And I went, what? He said, yeah, no one knows anything about him. So whatever it was, I couldn't sleep that night. And the next day I called Mount Vernon and I asked them, could they share anything with me? And there's one historian there, Mary Thompson. She's now the historian emerita. She's a great friend, a wonderful historian. She was the only one interested in the lives of the enslaved from 40 years ago, while the Mount Vernon administration was like, okay, we're not going to talk about that. And she was like, no, this is important. And I said to her, I'm nobody. I'm a journalist in New York. I'm a chef. I write cookbooks. I write about food. I just heard this name and I want to know. She sent me all the research she had. Wow. So generous. And it wasn't a lot, but everything she had. And that was it. And so I just did a dinner at Mount Vernon in honor of Hercules for 140 people, with a catering staff. And that dinner, what I did was using the household accounts, using descriptions, all the things I told you about, I recreated foods that he would have cooked, but that represented his life. And I dedicated that dinner to Mary, who was there. So it's kind of a long answer to your question, but that's
so
why.
you became a historian because of that.
Well, yeah, because of Hercules.
And are you writing about, I'm sorry,
No,
it's
no, no.
fascinating. Are you writing about that dinner somewhere? Yes.
Yeah, people keep asking me, I did just get sort of backed into reproducing it for an auction, a charity auction, which I don't really want to do, but I'm going to do it because the person who asked me is someone I love dearly. But so it was a great success. It was hosted by American Heritage Chocolate, which is a division of Mars Wrigley. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
How long did it take you to write this particular book from start to finish with all the research? And it must have taken you a while.
This book took 6 years.
Wow.
And then I continued doing the research. So by the time I write the biography, it will be about 18 years of research. Yeah, you're welcome. Somebody else had a, yeah.
Perhaps you said it, but why did Hercules self-emancipate, as you say, in 1797?
What were the circumstances of the self-emancipation? So the Washington family came back to Mount Vernon in the summer of 1796, as they often did, for a period of time. And while they were there, his son Richmond, who I mentioned here, he had been there in Philadelphia for about a year and then he had been sent back. The only reason he was there in the first place was because Hercules wanted him there. And there's a letter where Washington is saying to his secretary, send up Richmond, not because he's so great at anything, but because Hercules wants him. But he was not very good at the job, and so he was sent back. And so in 1796, some years later, 5 years later, Richmond is accused of stealing from a white servant, and Washington believes it's for the purpose of self-emancipating with his father. So when they went back for his last term, his last few months, into Philadelphia, he made Hercules remain at Mount Vernon, basically for safekeeping. And he had him doing things like digging ditches and, digging stumps out of the pathways at Mount Vernon. But I think that the real answer is, who does not want to be free? That's the answer, right? But the opportunity came then. And so that night, they had given the enslaved community rum to toast the general's birthday, and while that was going on, Hercules walked or rode or something off of the plantation. There's one more question. I'll answer it while we're walking to the thing.
Sorry,
Yes.
just kind of curious why Hercules, of all the slaves, I'm sure there were other slaves who were very, exceptionally talented at their jobs. How come he got a little extra sort of flexibility? He could leave at night. He was able to sell the slops.
Mhm.
What transpired between him and Washington, why was he a little more specially treated?
So I think that I can't tell you definitively, right, because Washington didn't write about that. But what I can tell you is that there were people in the enslaved community that had a special relationship with Washington, notably his enslaved body servant, William Lee, right? And I think the answer to that is this: enslaved people were human beings. They were not a monolith, just like none of us in this room are like anyone else in this room, right? And I think that Hercules had a force of character, a personality, a sense of self, like William did, that many other people did, and there was just some sort of connection there that we can't know. It doesn't make it any better. I always want to tell people that, right? Whatever Hercules' little bit of inches he got from Washington, it didn't make it better. But understand that the nature of enslaved people to one another, to their enslaver, to their captor, to people in the outside community, it was as different as all of our relationships to everybody we have in our lives. So I don't have a definitive answer for you, but, and he was also kind of, excuse my language, a badass. Like all the writing about him says that he was, right? And I like to think that Washington respected him within the context of that. He certainly didn't want to give him up,
Right.
but I think he understood the force of his character.
So, the Foodshed Forum is a space created for our community to explore our food system and its context and its origin as a way to better understand it and to therefore begin to change. And this book is just a wonderful culmination of that exploration, because it is truly a book that is beautifully written. It is subtle and gentle and yet raw with the pain of oppression. And so I want to thank you for bringing Hercules' story forth with such integrity and dignity. It's a gift to all of us, especially Black Americans. And when you read the book, if you haven't, you will feel it deeply. So the question was asked, why Hercules, which is perfect. And my second question to that is, what touched you about Hercules' story? Why has he drawn you, why has he captured your imagination?
I mean, I think that there's a lot of reasons. I'm going to answer that by telling you what my brother thinks. Right? This is his reason. So, in the summer of 1976, I was 8 years old, the bicentennial. My father from Trinidad decided he's going to bring his kids around all the American historic sites, because we're American, we're born here, and we need to be super proud of that, right? So we started in Boston, and then we're from New York City. We went to the Statue of Liberty, and then we went down to Philadelphia, and interestingly stood on line for the Liberty Bell right on top of the President's House site that had not yet been excavated, had no idea. And then we went to Mount Vernon. And when we were at Mount Vernon, the Mount Vernon Ladies, Association, they're doing their tour, and it's all about the grandeur of Washington and the loveliness of Mrs. Washington, et cetera, et cetera. And we get to the Washington bedroom, and the tour guide holds up the chamber pot and says, "Does anybody know what this is?" And so if my father were alive, he'd be 100 years old. He was much older when I was born, right? So when he grew up in Trinidad, still very rural, people were still using chamber pots and outhouses. And he said, "Yeah, I know what that is." And so he said it, and then he said, "Why don't you tell us who emptied it?" And she said, oh, the servants. And he said, "You mean the slaves? That's what you mean." And she kind of sloughed it off. And every room that we went to, whatever she said, he said, "And why don't you tell us who did that work?" And by the time we got out of the house, my father was simmering with rage, right? Barely controlled rage. And I had never seen my father like this. He was a school teacher. And what you have to understand in communities of color, in mixed race communities, especially someone of that age, he knew not to behave, he was raised not to behave a certain way in front of white people. You know, I'm just gonna say that, right? So the fact that my father was so angry and everybody saw it terrified me. And I had nightmares about Mount Vernon for years. And my brother thinks that's the reason. He said, you equate Hercules with our father. That's what it is. I don't think it's quite that, but I think that I do equate him with people who really rose up against incredible odds. And I just want to say something here, and I've said it, people have heard me say it, I'm going to say it again. He was an incredibly talented cook. He was a man who was self-possessed. He had agency. He knew how important he was. But so too did every other enslaved person, right? To survive slavery means you were remarkable. To have descendants means that you were remarkable, right? And we try to make this distinction. Historians do it too, right? The people who work in the field are not as skilled or as important as the people who work in the house or in the kitchen or who's a wheelwright, who's a cooper. But you understand a person who works in the field understands agriculture, understands irrigation, understands fertilization, understands blight, right? They're looking at plants and they know what to do to make them thrive because their lives depend on it, right? They're not simply laborers. Every one of them was remarkable.
And so our food system today is rooted and grounded in enslaved people who are really the foundational creation of our food and farming practices. Many of them go back and are rooted in indigenous and African practices and skills.
I mean, here's what I want to say to everybody is that I just want to remind you that the wealth of the American colonies and the Caribbean colonies was the wealth of food commerce, right? Sugarcane, right? Chocolate, spices, right? This is where this engine of economy came from. Yes, there were secondary streams of income, lumber, and early on it was animal skins and so on. But the most landings of this major economy was food, right? And not unlike the massive factory farming that we have today was the factory farming of the 18th century. The machines were enslaved labor. And also, by the way, not just enslaved African labor, but enslaved indigenous labor too, right? And learning from this acquired knowledge, right? So it's embedded in the very existence of our country.
Yes, and I'm gonna touch on that. Actually, I wanna call that out. But before I do, I wanna talk about the 18th century community culture within the context of food and the culinary landscape. You open the book with Hercules walking free. He's at market, and you capture the intimate nature of marketing and cooking and tasting very thoughtfully in these this opening chapter. Hercules is enjoying a bowl of pepper pot soup. He's tasting sage cheese, the confectionates, the pears, the spices. And another point in the book, you describe him eating the joints of meat, oysters on the dock, and other delicacies. The downtown streets and harbor were a hub of commerce, right? In Philadelphia in particular, the commons bustled with craftsmen and artisans, tradesmen, and all in the street, something we don't see today. So what role did the harbor or the dock play within community, but also as a community and food culture hub, and why open the book at market?
So I'll answer that part first. I opened the book in the Philadelphia market because it was the most famous market in America. It was one of the most famous markets in the world. All of you know Philadelphia cream cheese, right? I'm going to tell you why it's called Philadelphia cream cheese, because it was created in New York, in upstate New York. A farmer was trying to make Neuchâtel cheese. It didn't come out right, but he thought it was good, and he started selling it as Empire cheese. New York is the Empire State. When it was purchased by the first kind of big company that bought it to mass produce it, they said, no one's going to buy Empire cheese. We're going to call it Philadelphia cream cheese because everyone knows anything from Philadelphia is gourmet. Yeah. So, and the Philadelphia markets were so famous for everything they had, from all around the United States, from the Caribbean, from Europe, from India, from the entire world. And so the markets in Philadelphia started at the harbor and ended right in front of the president's house. And what they were these big sheds, right, huge, so that there were vendors on both sides, and the streets, if any of you know Philadelphia, the cross streets came in between each shed, and it went on like this up to 6th Street. So, Philadelphia was food, and food import was so important in Philadelphia. Confectionery was important in Philadelphia, that, this is the first time Hercules would have really been in this explosion of tastes and ingredients and people that he had never seen before, and that's why it was important for me to start it there. You asked me about the harbor, so I want you to think of the harbor in the 18th century America as kind of like social media today, right? This is where you were going to hear languages you never heard, where you're going to see people you've never seen, where you're going to see goods coming off boats that you never imagined, right? It was crowded. You could turn around from looking at you and look over here and see something completely different. And it was a place to get information. It was a place to trade. And the waterways were highways, right? So just like we have interstates, there was the coastwise trade up and down the Atlantic coast. For us, it's here, it was the sound, the rivers, a common description that Europeans would talk about when they came to New York, when they came to Philadelphia, they came to Boston, was harbors with masts so thick they looked like forests, right? So the harbor was really where everything happened. It wasn't this kind of gentle place where boats were just kind of bobbing along like we have now. That wasn't it at all. It was a massive depot it was an international crossroads.
So, and I hope this isn't like too hard of a question, but it did come up when I was thinking about how to engage more about the harbor. Is what do you think we've lost? What are we missing by all of that is now not as open, right? We don't
It's
walk in the
disassociated.
streets and we're not like slurping oysters or just being able to go down, and commerce doesn't happen as openly.
Well,
Unity, connection, is that all sort of romanticized or?
Well, I think there's the thing that we miss is so by being disassociated from food, we're disassociated from each other, right? You could open a cookbook, you could look at a social media post, you could look at a television show about how to make something from another part of the world. It's not the same as if somebody from that part of the world makes it for you and shares it with you. Because what they're handing you is a key to their culture. They're letting you in to a secret that they've held for generations, right? We don't have that anymore.
Yeah.
So in a place like Philadelphia, you did have that. You had Germans, and you had Swedes, and you had Caribbean people, and you had, Pepper Pot was from the Caribbean. There was a very famous pepper pot seller, she's in the book, named Polly Hain.
Yeah.
Selling pepper pot, right? So, and every ingredient that went into that pepper pot is the story of her ancestors. So that's what we lost. We lost the ability to empathize with each other's story.
Yeah. So powerful. So I want to talk about food systems as it relates to foodways. So our modern day industrial food system is rooted in the enslavement of African peoples and land theft and genocide of indigenous peoples, as you were just eloquently talking about. Centuries of systemic racism continues to shape not only our food system, but our culture at large. So can you talk about the through line within our food system? Again, big question, from the 18th century to today, and kind of bridge that for us. And if you could describe the food system at that time, like supply chains and the trade. And then one last question sort of nested in that is, as a culinary historian, what does taste mean to you? And why is preserving taste and flavor so important, especially as we lose it today?
Well, let me answer that first, right?
Yeah.
So taste. So before food systems became homogenized and factory farming and so on, food really had a sense of taste that came out of their terroir. We've heard this word, right? I was just talking to a friend of ours, Colette, and we were talking about, I don't know what we were talking, some spice from Trinidad, something, and I was saying how you could buy it here, and she was like, yeah, but it's not the same. It's not the same, because it wasn't made with the ingredients that came out of that dirt in our island, right? So that's what taste is. Taste is a sense of place. And as we homogenize what we are eating, and we have factory farming, and we have the same fertilizers and the same chemicals, everything tastes the same everywhere, right? So you lose a sense of place. Like, I don't think it's a great thing that you go to Starbucks in Vienna or in New York or in Dubuque and it tastes exactly the same. That's a problem, right? Because now you've disassociated yourself from New York and Dubuque and Vienna, right? So taste to me is a sense of place, and the people who live in that place. So the more we move away from it, the less opportunity we have to really understand that.
Well, it's interesting because you were touching on the global trade at the time. And so there's obviously a lot of emphasis within the food system transformation movement to regionalize our food system and the importance of localization, all of which is very important. However, we will always live within the context of a global food system. That's not going to change. It's important, right? Trade is obviously important and has been happening for, a millennia. So talk a little bit about that. And, trade was coming in from boats, and it's always been that way.
So you asked what the 18th century food system looked like, right?
Yeah.
So there's a mythology that North Americans, that the 13 colonies, people got their food by farming their own land and feeding themselves, right? It's not 100% of mythology. A lot of people did do that, right? A lot of people did that to sell to other people, just like now, right? There were people who lived in, urban environments or semi-urban environments, and they purchased their food. They didn't have a farm. They didn't spend all day, every day, putting by food just to simply live, right? So you did have that. But very early on in our history, we created what we now call single stream farming, right? So I just want you to picture that in the 17th and the 18th century, the colonies that were the most important to the European superpowers were not North America. They were the Caribbean for sugar, right? Because sugar was such a valuable commodity. So very quickly, they established vast plantations of sugar cane to the exclusion of everything else. So what do I mean by that? So how do people in this area, how do you think some of the wealthiest founding families in Greenwich and Westport and Darien made their money? They farmed grain to send to the West Indies to feed enslaved people, because not one bit of land in Jamaica, in Barbados, was given over to grow vegetables, to grow corn. It was all for sugar, or indigo, or cocoa, right? So there were farmers, yes they were. They were farmers benefiting from the transatlantic slave trade, right? So you have the single stream of sugar, or cocoa, or nutmeg, or what have you, right? And there was more diversity up here. There was more of that, like a little bit of everything, things going to market, but from there, it was the single stream. And using the sugarcane plantation methodology of Barbados, planters from South Carolina went down in the 17th century, and they wanted to learn how to reproduce this for rice, right? So enslaved people from the Ivory Coast were brought to South Carolina. The sugar plantation system was enacted in South Carolina in what is now called the Gullah Geechee communities, right? Very similar to Caribbean communities, very similar, right? Very retained West African culture. Single stream farming of rice. Then we had single stream farming of cotton, right? So, and then you had to import a lot of food from, if you wanted those delicacies, right? So it's actually not that different from now.
I was just thinking that.
Yeah.
As someone who studies the modern day food system, the industrial system, it's the same.
Yes.
It's the same thread.
It's essentially the same thing.
And yes.
Where the most profitable crops were single stream farmed. All energy, all effort was put into those crops. Other things were supplemented in various ways, from smaller farms or from imports.
A lot of which led to the Dust Bowl in the 1930s.
Exactly.
Where we've depleted our soil. And
Yeah.
so I want to move into foodways. So you write about the foodways of Hercules' kitchen in such a descriptive and tangible way, and it's lovely to read. And yet there are tensions between the kitchen being a space of culinary expression, technique, skill, and pride, all of which you very eloquently just spoke about. And yet, in the book, the kitchen is where I felt Hercules' enslavement the most. You know, those moments when he hangs up his apron at the end of the day and is able to walk free and walk the streets.
For a moment.
For a moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do Black American foodways serve as entry points into deeper conversations of enslavement as the foundation on which this country is built and shaped? And if you can talk about the ways in which African culture has influenced Black foodways and farming.
So I'm gonna say something to you, because actually I'm writing a book about this now, which is due in a month, and I'm kind of like sweating because it's not done.
You're here talking
And I'm here talking to you. Anything not to finish that book. And it's actually about the heritage of Caribbean food and its influence in the United States. So what I want to say to you is that the import of enslaved Africans directly into what was North America really largely happened in the 17th century into the early 18th century, right? And then more individuals were brought here from the Caribbean. So there was at least a century or more of time spent in the Caribbean, using local ingredients of the Caribbean and West African foodways, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really actually this bifurcated Africa by way of the Caribbean influencing American food. So for example, Hoppin' John is peas and rice, right? Johnny cake, we have Johnny cake, right? In some cases the corn goes away and it becomes just a fried bread we call bake. It's called something else somewhere else. Barbecues from the Caribbean. It was seen in the Caribbean by Europeans, and it was brought up into the American South, right? And that's indigenous foodways. So what I would tell you is that, to me, it's particularly soul food, but really all American food, right, is based on this foundation of making something from nothing, right? Because understand that in the colonial period, in the early period of settlement, not everyone ate like Washington. Regular people were not eating high on the hog in any kind of way, right? So there wasn't such a distinction between the food of African descent people and the food of European descent people. It was the food of people who were trying to get by, except that people of African descent knew how to do that better than anybody because there was no choice, right? So what I would say to you is that ability to kind of take what you have and turn it into something better, which is a very American idea, right? Like, do better, take what's given to you, make it into something to create opportunity. Well, enslaved Africans were doing this every day to survive. So to me, it is the foundation for American food, regardless of what it was. And of course, the knowledge of agriculture.
I was just going to say agriculture and the stories of the women braiding seeds in their hair. And
which is actually not true.
Oh,
but
that's so
people
interesting.
like to say that, but it's not true.
Narrative.
Yeah, it's not. It's not
Narrative
exactly
shape, yeah,
true.
that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of historians, we argue about this all the time, but understand the violence of the slave trade. Understand the violence of capture and imprisonment and being marched through water. Like, nobody was braiding anything into anyone's hair. You were just hoping not to be killed, right? Like, could there have been like latent seeds, you know, whatever? Like, is it possible? Yes, it's possible, but it's that requires forethought. The violence of the slave trade, it wasn't, the people for whom they were making the transaction were not the people who were captured. They didn't have time to plan, right? But, right, going to the Ivory Coast, finding those enslaved men who knew how to grow rice bringing the rice seeds back, having those men use their expertise to grow rice for South Carolina plantation owners.
Right. So I just cannot say enough how important your work is.
Thank you.
And I say that because our food system today, our industrial system, some of you may recognize this, others may not, but it is probably one of the more, how do you say it, exploitive, destructive systems. It is a leading cause of climate change and biodiversity loss and racial disparity and environmental degradation, right? And so to understand how to transform it and to discover and co-create a shared vision towards a path of another way, we have to understand this knowledge. We have to understand these through lines. Otherwise, we will just continue to repeat these patterns.
Well, right, because everything you described is what it's always been.
And it's always been.
It's not new, right? It has always been that way. So there has to be an understanding that we're repeating choices that were made. We need to take agency and decide not to repeat those choices.
And it's deep
Right.
work.
Yeah.
It's deep work to do that.
It's kind of like the promise of America. People, we're coming up on the 250th. Those of us who work in museums, we're doing a lot of work around this. And I was just on a panel about the 250th, and someone said, how do we make America live up to its promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? How do we get to what the promise was so that everybody can benefit from what we were promised? And what I said was, it did live up to its promise for to whom it was promised to. It wasn't promised to some of us, but the people it was promised to at that period of time, white men, it worked for them. It worked. It did live up to the promise, right? We have to stop saying, how do we live up to this imaginary ideal? We have to say to ourselves, when that ideal served a purpose at the time, let's make a new ideal based on who we want to be, and it's the same in food systems, right? Let's stop trying to live up to this imaginary ideal of a local and earth protective agricultural economy. It didn't exist here. That's not what happened. Let's decide that we want that to be the case.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna maybe reclaim, I don't know if that's the best word here, but what does reclaiming the culture of Black food mean to you? And as I'm talking to you, I don't know if that's the right question, because has it been lost within Black communities, right? As a woman of color, as a chef, as a culinary historian.
No, I don't think it's been lost. I think that within the community, so I can speak about the Caribbean, right? So we do what we do. We may not know why we do it, but it's there, right? So it hasn't been lost. It's not reclaiming it.
Right.
It's reclaiming a way to talk about it.
Yeah.
It's creating language for it, because it is there. It is 100% there.
So maybe it's a reclaiming of the narrative in a way, reclaiming storytelling.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Yeah, and owning it, right? Refusing to let other people speak for us in terms of what the food culture is, right? That's not to say there aren't great historians who shouldn't contribute. They should and they do, right? But having the agency to discuss it, the more work has to be done to give communities of color opportunities to get into positions of power to talk about our own history.
Yeah. So it's claiming I guess if there's any reclaiming or claiming, it's your history and your story. So if there was one Foodways, I don't know if you thought about this, but if there's one Foodways that we've lost, that is gone, and we could, get it back, what would it be?
I think, I spent a lot of time talking to colleagues in the indigenous communities, and we talk about this a lot, the loss of indigenous foodways, tribe to tribe in America, in the Caribbean. There's a little bit more knowledge here in North America. In the Caribbean, we have all but lost the native Caribs, the native Arawak, all of these foodways, all but almost lost. That's the thing I would like to see. somehow found again.
Mhm. So let that be so. And what's next for you, and how can people follow your work?
Well, what's next to me is always,
Is your book.
is Hercules always, and of course the museum. Please come visit us at Westport
The
Museum for
Westport
First
Museum.
History and Culture in downtown Westport. So that's where you can see what I do on a daily basis, is at the museum. And if any of you are on Instagram, my handle is nibblescribbleNYC, and I'm just, because I was born and raised in New York, and my website is almost done, it's justmyname.com. And I write for the New York Times, so my next article will be out in a few weeks. So.
Does anyone have any questions?
Hi, my name is Simone Forte. I'm of Ghanaian heritage. My parents are from Ghana. And one of the biggest points of frustration I personally have is with the recent popularity of Ghana. There's a lot of sort of members of the culinary world who are not Ghanaian, who are putting spins on West African cuisine to the detriment of the actual integrity of the cuisine. How do you, as a person of color in the culinary community, work, I don't want to say to gatekeep, but maintain the integrity, especially of Caribbean or Trinidadian cuisine?
No, that's such a good question. I mean, this is a point of frustration. I always talk about the fact that Caribbean cuisine wasn't a thing until certain people decided it was a thing, right? Like, so the establishment of the food world in America decided, oh, you guys have food now. Suddenly we have food. We know we've had food so I mean, well, it's so tricky. So what I would say, what I advocate for is that if you are claiming that this is authentic, then it must be a person from that culture who is speaking for and making that food, right? Like, somebody just recently did a whole thing on doubles, which is a thing we have in Trinidad, a Caribbean person, but I was like, wow, that's okay. That's, but what she did, to her great credit, was she didn't claim in any way that she knew about it. She went to all the experts and asked them and just repeated and quoted them and so on. So I think the answer is, if people are going to do these fusions or these creative twists and creative spins, they need to cop to that. They need to say that's what they're doing. Don't pretend that you're doing something authentic when you're not. And it's because that's appreciation versus appropriation, right? I really appreciate the food of Ghana. I admire it. I want to, use it as a foundation for something that I want to do. Please know that this is not Ghanaian food. I am not qualified to speak about Ghanaian food. And I think that if people could just remember, just do that. Just be polite. Just honor that. Like, you wouldn't take, your friend's car and pretend it was your own. Like, just it's the same level of there was a whole thing, I don't know if you saw this, I don't know what magazine, it might have been Bon Appetit, but got totally destroyed for, somebody did a recipe for soup jumu, which is a Haitian soup, and I was like, what is this? Because that ain't it, right? And it was somebody who wasn't Haitian, right? Why would you do that? Like, I don't know why somebody would want to go out on a limb like that anyway, and embarrass yourself.
We're naming names. What I'm referring to is Jamie Oliver infamously tried to make his version of jollof rice, and the backlash was swift.
Right, but what he should have said is, I did not grow up making jollof rice. I don't know from jollof rice. I admire it. I would like to try my hand on it, and let me apologize ahead of time to anybody that this is not the thing. Like, I know it's not the actual thing, right? It's complicated, and it's a case by case sort of.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, during the revolution, before and after, when a person went into a tavern, they ate food or did they just drink? And if they ate food, was it the fancy food or the common person food? What were you given in a restaurant? They didn't call them restaurants, but you know what I mean.
They call it, right. So it really depended. There were taverns for every level of society, right? So in Philadelphia, for example, the City Tavern, there was a City Tavern in Alexandria, there was Francis Tavern which is still there in Lower Manhattan. These were taverns that served the better class of people, right? And so they served very fine food. And then there were what was called middling, or middle class taverns, right? And that would be more common things, like you might get like a meat turnover, you might get slices of pie, and you might get slices of a roast, but not a roast beef, maybe it was a chicken, right? That type of thing. They might have served beer and cider, but not claret or port or Madeira, right? So it's just like now, actually. You could go to a fast food place, and their fast food place were street food sellers who were selling oysters or like those meat turnovers or cookies. Or you could go to something a little bit better or something a little bit, and so on. Some taverns, more like public houses, were just for eating and drinking. And taverns generally, the term became interchangeable, but at one point there were rooms for lodging. Right.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And there's a lot of very good books on tavern, like tavern life. I'm not remembering any of them right now, but there's some very, very good ones out there that you can kind of read about American tavern culture.
This has been such a rich and just delightful conversation. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having